So, Rabbi said, it's a tough sugya. It's a tough sugya. A few chavra were asking me on Shabbos, what exactly is going. Yeah. A couple of chavra were asking me on Shabbos, as Mamdani became the mayor of New York City. What's going on with Satmar Jews that apparently 30% of Jews in New York voted for him? Which meaning Satmar and left wing, which is interesting. There's this Satmar Jews and left wing Jews in Israel, in New York City, all voted for Mamdani. Modern Orthodox Jews did not. I think most conservative Jews did not. There was a big push. I think reformers, Lakan. Certainly unaffiliated Jews, young Jews on campuses that are not connected to anything, all voted for him. He's Moshe for them, right? He's the guy. That's what they're looking for in the world. The question is, and all these pictures started coming out already Sukkot time of Mamdani sitting in Sukkot with Chavra in Williamsburg and Kiryas Yoel and in right with big. By the way, not a shruggy. No, he's not playing games there, right? Not a shruggy. He's sitting with a big black yarmulke. He was like they were shpizin. He's coming in on the Sukkot, and everybody's smearing him up. And at the end of the day, even those guys have to agree that he hates Israel. He doesn't like Jews, right? So what's going on? Where does this whole mahalach come from?
School vouchers.
So I think it's inappropriate to chalk it all up to school vouchers, because at the end of the day, these are Erlich Yidden in the sense that they are Shomer Shabbos, Shomer Kashrus, Taras Mishpacha. They keep all the chumras, meaning these are people that live lives of, at least in theory, I'm sure, yesh v'yesh in every community.
They're not saying he's a tzaddik. They're just voting him in. He was already going to be in anyway.
Maybe.
He had a chance before.
Maybe. Maybe there's a difference between now and then, but there's a question of, with regards to like your principles, like do we stand with this guy? Do we stand fighting tooth and nail against him? And I felt the need to talk about this because on a number of levels, I think that it's important for us to talk about. Right? What's the kesher to Blumenthal to talk about this mitzvah? We're not in New York. We're not Satmar Chasidim. What are we even talking about here? And I want to address this from at least two areas, the things that are pushing me and bothering me to talk about this. Aleph, people are interested. Meaning people want to know, they want to understand. There's an understanding that needs to be had here, which is part and parcel of our mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, and understanding where other Jews are coming from. And I think this is important for us to understand where other Jews come from. I think that it's important for us to understand the positions and the understandings of all Jews. Whether we like them, meaning we like the Jews, but whether we like their perspectives, we don't like their perspectives, it is important for us to know where that comes from. Meaning, what is the mahalach that these people are following, especially considering that the mahalach that Satmar Chasidim are following is a mahalach that is ostensibly based upon the same principles as 99.8% of what we believe in, which is that Taras Misinai, that the Chachamim have authority to make dinim midrabanan, that every Jew is obligated to do the utmost for Klal Yisrael and for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and for Shemiras Torah mitzvahs, meaning Jews that are not observant of Torah mitzvahs have values and principles that come from outside of Torah. But at least on a surface level, and hopefully much more than that, all religious Jews share common values in like 99.8% of everything. Exactly what the numbers are, I don't care. But I'm saying the vast majority of everything. Most religious Jews have the same value system. We have vehement debates about the subtle differences, but it's important in those vehement debates to understand where the other side is coming from. Being that we come from the same tradition. Right? We agree on almost everything, so the fact that we disagree on that, well, why? Where does their perspective come from? And arguably, more important for us is to understand, where does our perspective come from? Why don't we agree with them? Or maybe we do. And that's also important for us to understand. That's Aleph, is the just getting a handle on what Klal Yisrael thinks. That's Aleph. Base, and this is not less important, maybe even more important, and you'll see why in a second, is there is a deep Yetzer Hara that exists amongst people that are not, let's say, without giving too many labels, of like the shtreimel wearing varieties, right? When a Jew that doesn't wear a shtreimel sees a Jew that does wear a shtreimel do something that he thinks is sleazy, that he thinks is slimy, and he thinks is like underhanded and uncomfortable. And so what that does is two things. One, you lose respect for that guy. And two, it's a shtickle heter. It's a shtickle heter of like, okay, he keeps all of those mitzvahs. But at least I'm not doing da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So it becomes a shtickle heter. Meaning, if you look at those pictures of Mamdani in the sukkahs and you say, look, it's all good and well that they're eating and sleeping in the sukkah in the snow and and they keep all of the chumras and they have all of the Shem Yichud Kutcha Baruch Hu before they say everything and that. And I don't do all of that. But who says that they're more from than me? Maybe I'm more from than them because my overarching principles of life are more in accordance with what the HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. But there's definitely a Yetzer Hara that makes us say, I'm at least not worse. I don't know if I'm better, I don't know if they're better, but at least I know what's right and wrong. And then it casts aspersions on the entirety of Frumkat Bichlal. In order to understand this position, I think that maybe you'll agree that this position is justified. Maybe you'll agree that it is not justified. But at least try to understand where it comes from. I think it is imperative for us to at least open up. And if you're asked the historians, they will tell you that this perspective starts maybe as early as the 1700s, certainly by the mid-1800s, around the time of the Chasam Sofer and the beginning of Reform, that there's this institution called ultra-orthodoxy, bless you. Something called ultra-orthodoxy. It used to be that there was something called Jews. Once upon a time, there was something called Jews. And then came along the Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement, and the Haskalah, actually, what the Haskalah did was it forced Jews to define their Judaism in a much more exacting way. Because the Haskalah was saying you could be Jewish originally. The idea was you can be Jewish at home and German on the street. You don't need to hold back from engaging in German culture, in Western culture, and proclamations of emancipation, and you'd be able to join the universities and join the businesses and join the colleges and join the workforce and Shalom Yisrael, and you could be a Jew at home and a Westerner in the street. That was the idea. The net result of this is that Judaism was hemorrhaging Jews. Jews were just leaving religion left, right, and center. They gave up. The late 1700s, early 1800s in Germany saw the largest percentage in all of history of Jews leaving Judaism, converting to Christianity without any force. Nobody put a gun to their head and said convert. Jews were just abandoning Yiddishkeit because it was something available to them. Right? You could be not Jewish anymore. And Reform, to a certain extent, was trying to be metak in that. They were trying to figure out a way for you to still hold on to some kind of Judaism. And all of a sudden, you now have another kind of Judaism that is not halachic, that is not the original. I mean, the original Reform were from people. Like, most of the things that like original reform did, today you would look and be like, yeah, that's fine. Like they gave drushes in German, not in Yiddish. I think we'd all be okay with that, right? It's nope. They moved the beamer to the front of the room. Okay, we move around the beamer. And then there were a bunch of other things that slowly but surely started changing the way that Judaism looked. And all of a sudden, you now have something called orthodoxy. Orthodox means we keep Torah mitzvahs. We don't water it down. We don't change it up. We are not responding to the openness of the Haskalah with this idea of we need to open up Yiddishkeit. We are responding to the openness of the Haskalah with putting up boundaries and saying this is who we are, and we're not katan, we're not bound to it, we're not changing anything. We are who we are, we do what we do, zeh hu zeh. That's it. And overwhelmingly, most from communities in Europe in the 1800s were Orthodox. And all of a sudden then came along something called Zionism. Late 1800s, where it began from and what the impetus was, notwithstanding, Zionism was first and foremost a Jewish nationalist movement that came as a result of looking at what was going on in Europe and saying, no amount of emancipation has made things better for Jews. Just didn't help. They'll never accept us. Meaning, we always thought, for thousands of years, we thought that if we will become more like them, then they will accept us. And finally, we managed to. Meaning, the Haskalah was incredibly successful. Meaning, from the perspective of the Jew that wants to be as European as possible. The Haskalah was incredibly successful. Jews were in every sphere of European life. They were professors, and they were poets, and they were playwrights, and they were historians, and they were, everything in it. Meaning Yiddish culture flourished. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was amazing. Yiddish culture, right? That's the thing, by the way, that was exported to the Lower East Side that became like part and parcel of New York, where like every New Yorker knows the word schlepp and knows what rye bread is and knows what lax is. The idea of like Yiddish culture as opposed to Jewish culture, which is interesting. Jewish culture is not what influenced New York. Yiddish culture was. It was the Yiddish culture of like the 1910s, 1920s. We're talking the Jews that came to America before they were chased out of Europe, before the war. Yiddish culture deeply influences America. And America, to a large extent, is born, American Jewish Yiddish culture is born from the Jews that didn't have to flee. I mean, life wasn't amazing, but like nobody was killing them. Yeah, there were revolutions and the Bolsheviks and there was stuff, but Jews left. And then all of a sudden there was this movement of Zionism, which was effectively, no amount of emancipation has helped us. We need to get out of here.
And the orthodoxy differentiation wasn't enough for them? So they have to go...
No. These were Jews that had already given up on Torah mitzvahs.
Okay.
For the Jews that had given up on Torah mitzvahs, it didn't help. Right, this is like that moment that like Theodore Herzl sees in the Dreyfus trial, that like, here you have a Frenchman that's as French as French could be. But because he's a Jew, he's not accepted. Right? Because he's a Jew, he's still going to be the scapegoat.
You're saying people from the Haskalah movement.
Yeah.
Became Zionists. Okay.
Meaning they were like, we need to have our own country. I mean, Herzl was interesting. Herzl basically, as like a one-man show, went around to like all of the heads of states around Europe before the First World War, right? Like where there were kings still of like everywhere, and was like, look, you don't like Jews. I have a solution. Let's ship all the Jews to Israel. That was his idea. And like people were into it. They were like, yeah, you're right. We don't like Jews. Let's take them away and put them somewhere else. And I understand that original reform was intensely anti-Zionist. Why? Because they wanted to be as German as possible. Don't differentiate us and tell us that we need to go to our ancient homeland. They stripped the Siddur from all references and mentions of Yerushalayim. So Reform was deeply anti-Zionist, but Zionism was born out of the people that had abandoned Torah and mitzvahs. Those are the people that originally became Zionist. Now, if you are a frum Jew living in Warsaw or in Vilna or wherever else, it might have been, look at every Jewish last name, right? And meaning anywhere that was a frum Jewish community in Europe in the mid-1800s, certainly the late 1800s, Zionism was something that was completely, it was antithetical to everything that you believed in.
You didn't have a home, is that what you're saying?
No, meaning...
The frum Jew didn't have a place.
The frum Jew had a place.
Yeah.
He had his shtetl. He had his yeshiva. This is the era, we're talking about the era of like the major, in the Hasidische Welt, like you have a malchus of Hasidus that's going on in Warsaw. Certainly after the First World War, massively, but even before, you're talking all of the shtetl. You have Geren, you have Belz, and you have Bobov, and you have Amshnov, and you have Ishbitz, and you have Piazat. All the names of Hasidim and that's going on in Poland. And you have Chabad that's going on in Russia and Ukraine and in Lithuania. There's Jewish communities, very active, and all the yeshivas. The yeshiva Shabbat. This is where you have the era of Volozhin and Slobodka and Varduk and all of these major Panovich, all of these major yeshivas. Like this is the time. Chavetz Chaim and Radin and these yeshivas. So if you're part of that, and a bunch of Jews are meeting in Basel to talk about a homeland for irreligious Jews, you're like, all right, cool, do whatever you want. Lo ichpat li, lo ma'anyen oti. I know where I live. I know what I'm doing. Like life is what it is, and I'm putting up the walls, and I'm making sure that my children don't end up going off the derech.
So it wasn't a conflict. They were fine. They were like, okay, do what you have to do.
Do what you, meaning people were handling about it, but the late 1800s, like overwhelmingly religious Jews were not interested in this thing at all. As far as religious Jews are concerned, we've been in Europe for the last 1800 years, maybe 2500 years. We will go back to Eretz Yisrael when Mashiach comes. Our grandparents davened for Mashiach, their grandparents davened for Mashiach, and we will daven for Mashiach, and we will go back to Eretz Yisrael when Mashiach comes. That's it. Now, that's not to say that the Jewish people weren't interested in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, they always were. We davened for it for years and years and years, and it was common that Jews would, certainly Rabbanim, once they retired, would go to Eretz Yisrael. But you couldn't live in Eretz Yisrael. You couldn't raise a family in Eretz Yisrael. Very hard to do. There was nothing there. It was a desert wasteland. A couple of Yidden in Tzvat and a couple of Yidden in Yerushalayim. There was that's it. That's the. And in order to live in Eretz Yisrael, you were supported by communities of Chutz La'aretz that donated money to the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. Not because they were settling the land of Israel, but because you had to support the yeshivas and the kollel that were in the old city. That's what it was. That's the whole thing. You had a little bit in Tzvat and you had a little bit in the old city. That's all that there was. You had some in Yaffa and some in Haifa, a couple of Yidden here and there. But there was no industry, there was no sovereignty, there was no army, there was nothing. A couple of Bedouin Arabs that were floating around. There were certainly no Palestinians. Right? There was nobody there. The place was like it was a wasteland. You look at the map today, like major swaths of Saudi Arabia. Nobody lives there. Maybe a couple of people here and there. Why does nobody live there? Because there's nothing there. Why would anybody want to live there? There's nothing to do. So people would make religious pilgrimages to, the holy city of Jerusalem. Jews did that, and Muslims did that, and Christians did that, and there was what to talk about. But other than that, there was nothing. The descriptions that you have that the Rambam says about Yerushalayim, and that the Ramban says about Yerushalayim in the 1100s and the 1200s, basically were identical to what people were describing of Yerushalayim, what Mark Twain describes of Israel in the 1800s. Nothing happened for 600, 700, 800 years. There's nothing there. Well, here and there, a shtibel, a shtetl, a masha, or something. But nothing's going on. We daven there. And all of a sudden you have a group of Jews that are making their way to Israel with this idea of Zionism. I'm like, okay, these are the Jews that we are hoping and praying that our children don't become. Right? Because the Jews that are going are the Jews that are not connected to Torah mitzvahs. They've abandoned Torah mitzvahs. We're doing everything that we can to hold it all together. That's the basic history of the whole everything. Meaning, if you were a frum Jew in 1900, there was a 99 out of 100% chance that you were not interested in Zionism at all. Klal lo. It just wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing that you would care about or be interested in or have any conversation about. You'd be davening that your children didn't become like those people because they didn't believe in God, they were communist, they were Bundist, they were atheist, like they didn't believe in anything. They want to go settle in the land of Israel, sayonara, go do whatever you want. Like, I'm waiting for Mashiach and that's what I'm going. In the meantime, my job is to raise my children to be shomer Torah and mitzvahs. That's it. And then the first half of the 1900s happens. The First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust. And basically, everybody's wiped out. Meaning, not everybody, but every community. It's not a single surviving community. There are surviving people, one from a town and two from a city. And then they have to figure out what do we do and where do we go. And the only places that people could go, overwhelmingly, because every single country shut their borders, the places that people could go was Eretz Yisrael, and a shtickle trickling into America, shtickle trickling into South Africa, to Australia, to England. But nobody was really taking Jews. Certainly not before the war, and after the war, refugee camps. It took another 10, 15 years for people, even more, 20 years, for people to clear out of Europe. And the survivors to find what they could find and get out of there. And 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, 1945 to 1948, all of a sudden, there's a declaration of independence of the State of Israel. Now, if you were a Jew living in Europe that was trying to be frum before the war, you've now heard about the founding of the State of Israel, which all the Arabs hate. They're trying to kill everybody. You have all of the trauma of everything that's going on from the Holocaust and everything that you've seen. You are interested in going to the land of Israel. The idea of people making a state doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? Just lay low, shut up, zip it, and try to survive. Try to rebuild as much as you can. We're trying to ensure the survival of the Jewish people. Right? If you're from Jew, you want to make sure that Ben Gurion is an outspoken anti-religious figurehead. The Knesset is not a group of people that believe in Torah mitzvahs. They don't believe in Shabbos, they don't believe in Kashrus, they don't believe in Taras Mishpacha. The pictures and the videos that you see are boys and girls dancing together, singing Hava Nagila. These are not from Jews. These are the people that are trying to steal my children away and convert them to being whatever. And I've made this point in other chaburis and other shurim and other locations. This is it's not a chiddush. It's a very poignant remark of Jewish history that Rav Shirky likes to talk about in the context of Rav Kook. That Rav Kook was born into a world where 80% of Jews were shomer Torah mitzvahs and 20% were not. And by 1935, Rav Kook died in a world where 80% of Jews were not shomer Torah mitzvahs and 20% were. And that's before the Holocaust. Right? 80% of Jews in 1935 were no longer shomer Torah mitzvahs in European Jewry. The Sephardi world is a different question entirely, because the Sephardi world, overwhelmingly what we mean by the Sephardi world, this is very racist to say, against Sephardim, because Sephardim are not one monolithic group that we, as Ashkenazim, call them, because Iraqis and Moroccans and Syrians and Libyans and Algerians and Egyptians and Yemenites are all completely different minhagim, right? Meaning they happen to be overwhelmingly in communities that were more Muslim and Arab in terms of control, but Persian Jews were never under Arab rule. Persians are not Arabs, right? And Byzantines, like Turks, are not Arabs. But what do we mean by the Sephardi world? It means the world that didn't encounter the Haskalah, right? Meaning they never went through this process of becoming Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox and Reform and conservative, which only existed in America. I mean, all of that didn't exist by what we today call the Sephardi world. It's the world that didn't have that. Which is why by Sephardim, there's no such thing as somebody that's not Orthodox. There might be somebody that eats pork on Yom Kippur, but he feels very bad about it and says slichot. Like,
For a month.
Right, for a month. 100%. Meaning he feels very bad about it. Sephardim are much more comfortable with their sins. What does it mean? They're comfortable with their sins is they don't feel the need to justify that their sins are not sins. They don't have to rewrite the religion to say that the sins are mutter because the Torah doesn't come from us. They all believe in Torah Messina. They all believe in the authenticity and the authority of the Masorah and the Chachamim. Sometimes I'm weak-willed and I like to do Averos. South Africans, by the way, have the same problem/solution because most South African Jews descend from Lithuanians. In Lithuania, there was no Reform conservative either, meaning in Vilna there was, but in most of the other small towns there wasn't because there was no Haskalah because the non-Jews, they were completely uneducated. It's not like there was nothing to talk to about. Like when a non-Jew, I heard this from Rav Goldfund at the Tzaddik in South Africa, in Johannesburg. He told me that when a South African Jew from the old time, from Lithuania, if he didn't want to be frum, he wasn't frum, but he certainly didn't want to be like Yana. He didn't want to be like the Goyim, because they didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to write, they didn't know how to sign, check, or write their own name. When a non-Jew had to take a document, had to sign a business deal, he went to the local Jew who knew how to read. Meaning literacy was not common by the peasant folk in Lithuania. So there was no drive to be like them. So there was no reform. There was no, in the small towns, South African Jews they came from places where they didn't care about that, and they came to South Africa where the only non-Jews were blacks and Afrikaners, and nobody wanted to be like either of those groups either, so it was just, you stayed the way you were. Which meant you didn't keep Shabbos, you didn't keep Kashrus, but you knew what Shabbos and Kashrus were. Which is why your classic South African Jew would drive to shul on Shabbos morning, and if he would get to shul and see there's no mechitza, he'd get in the car and drive to another shul. Shul is shul. Shul is shul. I might not keep what the Torah wants me to keep, but I know what it is. Right? I believe in the religion that I don't observe. I know what it is. Don't tell me that I know what it is and I know what it isn't. That was that. Kacha. So, the Sephardi world didn't have this. But the Ashkenazi world, 80% by the time 1935, by the end of Rav Kook's life, 80% of the Jewish people were not Shem Torah mitzvahs. And the 20% that were were clawing on to this, maybe we'll have children that will survive. And by the end of the Holocaust and the founding of the state, all of this now comes to a head in that the Zionists are not part of that mission and vision of the return of the Jewish people to a world of Mashiach and Geula and Yerushalayim Shalmala. These are people that are trying to make a state of Israel like all the other states. And not only do they not believe in the same things that we, from Jews, believe in, they have entirely usurped the idea of what the state of Israel is supposed to be. Because practically speaking, and this was Soloveitchik writes about in Kol Fake, that the existential question of Zionism, of religious Zionism, is in the Siddur. If you open up a Siddur, the Siddur tells you, and this is based on the Gemara's in Megillah, the Gemara's in Brachos, the order of how things are supposed to be. We begin in the week of Shmoneh Esrei, brachas in the middle. Ata chanu l'olam das, you give knowledge, wisdom, understanding. Bracha Hashem chanu das. We want wisdom, we want knowledge, we want understanding. Hashivenu avinu l'sarasecha, bring us close to your Torah, bring us back to your Torah. Karvenu malkeinu l'sarasecha, bring us close to be Eved Hashem. V'asurenu b'tshuva shlema l'levanecha, and return us to you in tshuva. Who's the us? Klal Yisrael. We should return, meaning we say every Musaf of Yom Tov, we were sent out of our land as a result of our sins. We were exiled because we messed up. We did Averis, so Hashem kicked us out. So we begin, give us wisdom and help us to do tshuva. Help us to do tshuva. Then slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, forgive us from, once we've done tshuva, we want slicha. We want Hashem, forgive us. Now that we've corrected ourselves, forgive us. And then and then you're going to redeem us. Because you're the guy. And then comes refuah, meaning heal us of all of our problems. Baruch Aleinu, give us parnasa. Tekaba shofar gadol chereseinu, sound the shofar to bring us back to Eretz Yisrael.
You're saying to do them out of order.
The whole thing is out of order. There's no geula. There's no tshuva. There's no slicha. There's no refuah. What do you mean there's geula now? It's not what are you talking about? None of this makes any sense. None of this makes any sense. What are you doing? What I'm trying to paint the picture of here is that the perspective of anti-Zionism, religious anti-Zionism, is the status quo of Klal Yisrael for the last 2,000 years. It is, we will weather this storm. Whatever the storm is, whether the storm is Khmelnytsky massacres of the 1600s, or the Spanish Inquisition of the 1400s, or the Rheinfleisch massacres of the 1300s, we're going to weather the storm. That's it. We're going to figure out a way to survive. That's the goal. Survive. And what does survival mean? It means do everything that you can to ensure that your children are shomer Torah and mitzvahs. That's it. Because if you can put together a yeshiva of 1,000 bachrim, and one of them becomes enough of a Talmid Chacham that he knows enough to be able to pass that on, and there's 6 of those yeshivas in Europe, and 5 of those bachrim are murdered, and there's one that survives, he can rebuild Yerushalayim. That's the goal. It's just a numbers game. As much as you possibly can, every ounce of everything is dedicated to ensuring the survival of Klal Yisrael, and the only way to do that is have as many children as you possibly can manage, survive on whatever limited things you can survive on, teach as much Torah as you possibly can, and make sure that when the next storm comes and destroys whatever it destroys, Klal Yisrael survives. That's it. That has been modus operandi, big adult. Now there's good times and bad times in Jewish history. I'm not painting a very bleak picture, but big adult, that is the emotional reality of most of Jewish history throughout 2,000 years of Jewish exile, since Churban Bayit Sheni and probably since Churban Bayit Rishon. That's the chazaka. That is what we are trying to do. Survival of the Jewish people. That's the goal. Beginning, middle, and end. And without understanding that, you cannot understand what Satmar Chasidim think today. Because, and here's the kicker, they think exactly what their great-grandparents thought. That's it. The goal is survival. Make sure that you survive. It's worked for the last 2,000 years and will continue to work. Which means, whatever you can do to ensure the survival of the Jewish people, that's what you're going to do. Every politician is an oisver, low-life, good for nothing. Every non-Jew is of Soines Yaakov. That's even the ones that love you don't love you. Even the ones that support you don't support you. So there's no such thing as like, no, how could you support this politician of that politician? They all, as much as if any of them from this perspective, any non-Jewish ruler politician in a dark alley, behind closed doors, if they could push a button and get rid of the Jewish people, they would do it in a second.
It doesn't apply to all religions or many religions, or just specifically Jews? Politicians.
Again, Jews are trying to survive. What anybody else thinks, we don't care. Our job is to survive. Is to ensure the survival of culture.
The politician in the dark alley.
Yeah.
You're saying specifically the Jews are the ones that are bothering him more than other religions?
Maybe yes, maybe not. But as far as this perspective of the Jewish people is, maybe he hates other people. Maybe he hates everybody. But I'm going to do whatever I can to do two things. One, make sure that I get as much positivity as I possibly can. And two, that I avoid as much negativity as I possibly can, because we will weather the storm. Whatever the storm is, we will weather it. That's the goal. More mostas and more chesed and more Torah and more yeshivas and more Talmidei Chachamim. And as much as you can make more money, you make more money, and then you have more children, and you ensure the survival of the Jewish people. That is it. And and we will hold up that banner until HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides that he is going to be Goel the Jewish people, Baruch Atah Hashem Goel Yisrael. And then he'll redeem us. The goal is to survive until Geula. What's going on in the interim? Nothing. Meaning there's nothing else relevant. That's it.
So what's the point of whining and dining someone like a Mamdani as opposed to someone who's not as extreme as him?
Again, because the point is this. Else the tzad that he might win, that he does win, the goal is make sure to be as friendly with him as you possibly can, because...
I don't know if it makes a difference. I don't think he'll be a real friend anyway.
No, because fake friends are better than not friends.
Just olam tikach.
That's
basically
Meaning, the point is, my goal is to survive. I think that you hate me, and I think that you hate me, and I think that you hate me, and I think that you hate me. And even if you don't hate me, you definitely don't care about me. I care about me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares about me, and I care about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I want my children, as many of them as possible, to be Talmidei Chachamim, to raise Jewish families, to continue Klal Yisrael.
And Maras Ayin isn't a factor in...
It's not Maras Ayin. This is Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh of Klal Yisrael. Pikuach Nefesh of Klal Yisrael.
But I've never heard them come out and say that either.
So, you know why they've never said that? Because there's a ma'aseh that they say about two little fish that are swimming through a river. You know this ma'aseh? Two little fish swimming through a river. They meet an old fish, an old wise fish. And the old wise fish looks at the two little fish and goes, "Young fish, be very careful. There are nets in the water up ahead." And the one little fish looks at the other little fish and says, "What's water?" Meaning, this is so. I'm saying if there would be a Satmar Chassid sitting right here, he would look at me like, "You've just spent 45 minutes saying nothing." Of course, Pasha, it's very pshuti. Like, obviously, it's so obvious. Our only goal is the survival of Klal Yisrael. That's it. And in order for Klal Yisrael to survive, as we did in Bavel, and as we did in the Rhinelands, and as we did in Warsaw, and as we did in Spain, and as we did in Auschwitz, what we need to do is survive. And the way to survive is Torah. That's it. And as much as you can make money, you make money, because that supports Torah. And as much as you can be friends with politicians, you be friends with politicians, so that it supports Torah. That's it. That's the only thing that needs to happen, because we need to survive until the Geula happens. That's it. That's the whole discussion. There's nothing else.
So, Chasidim living in Eretz Yisrael choose not to join the army, and who are against the army.
Okay, that's a whole separate discussion. And the reason that I said that this is a whole separate discussion is that there's a piece of this that I skipped ahead. Because after the Balfour Declaration, by around 1920, there were many, many, many frum Jews that started seeing Eretz Yisrael as a place to go to, and that maybe we should be investing in Eretz Yisrael, even if not along the same lines as the Chalotzim of the secular Zionist movement. And you already had like the beginnings of religious Zionism in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. But all of a sudden there becomes a religious end to Zionism. Al regel achas, the Chassidus that became largest in Eretz Yisrael after the war. What's the biggest Chassidus in Eretz Yisrael?
Bells or
The biggest Chassidus in Eretz Yisrael today is Ger.
it is? Okay.
Ger Chasidim are the biggest. Why? Because after the war, the Ger Rebbe went to Eretz Yisrael. Because it's the Imre Amos. Because he had already sent his brother and his nephew before the war to go buy land in Eretz Yisrael. Because they were investing in Eretz Yisrael. They became very wealthy as a result of it, because the sand dunes that they could afford at that point in time are now called Tel Aviv. That's why the Ger Rebbe, I think, is like the 5th wealthiest man in Israel, because those sand dunes now have Azrieli Tower.
Bnei Brak is Tel Aviv.
So what?
Bnei Brak is in Tel Aviv.
No, I'm saying, forget Bnei Brak. I was saying the sand dunes that later became downtown Tel Aviv are still owned by the Ger Rebbe's family, owned by the Alter family. Because they believed that there was a religious validity in starting to make their way to Eretz Yisrael. Not necessarily to be Zionist, politically, but to be religiously oriented in the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, actively. That was what was going on in Poland. Overwhelming, meaning you have Ger and you have Amshinov and Sachachov. Avnei Nezer was very chazak about this. And the Ger was the Imre Emes and Svasemis Bavoim were very chazak about this. And Amshinov, Belz was a little on the fence, but ultimately they made their way to Eretz Yisrael as well. As opposed to in Hungary and Romania, where you have Satmar and you have Munkac, who thought that the whole thing was, because remember, this is where the Haskalah was the strongest before, that we need to put up the biggest walls, and any identification with any of that political movement is religious suicide. And so,
Did they move Munkac and anyone from Romania?
at all, and after the war, those that survived, the Satmar Rebbe stopped off in Eretz Yisrael for like a minute, but ultimately they all came to America. Because Eretz Yisrael is not the place to go right now. Not only is it religious suicide, it is also fundamentally against what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. He doesn't want us to go back to Eretz Yisrael yet.
Doesn't Satmar more recently have
Yes. And there's
in Eretz Yisrael? I don't remember which Rebbe.
yes, there's a shtickle. Yes, there's what to talk about. There's a lot of complexities. I'm talking in broad strokes. Satmar became the biggest Chassidus outside of Eretz, meaning certainly in America, because fundamentally, religiously, Eretz Yisrael is not the place that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be. Now, so far what we've spoken about is history and politics. We're going to learn 2 seconds of Torah. Because what I want to point out here is that the more obvious reality, certainly the late 1800s, early 1900s, is Satmar. Satmar makes the most sense. It is the status quo of the Jewish people. The Chiddush of religious Zionism is a Chiddush. And whenever you are Mechadish, you have to have, right? You have to prove your position is correct. Because you're you're somebody that's removing the chazakah. There's a chazakah that this is what works for the Jewish people. Who says that something now has changed? Who says that something's changed? Just because a bunch of irreligious Jews in Basel decided that they wanted to make a Jewish state. But that changes the objective of the Jewish people? Make it easy. Because there's people waving a flag and saying, Lias am chavshi be'artzenu. Now, all of a sudden, we need to cower to some political enterprise. You understand where this is coming from? It's also why, by the way, and I say this, I hope nobody misunderstands it, but it's why all of the things that people try to force Charedim, certainly anti-Zionist Charedim, all the things that you say, if we take away their money, if we take away their funding, it's going to force them to, You misunderstood the whole thing. Every time that anybody says something like that, all that it does is reinforce that we need to put up the walls and protect our children and be moser nefesh for the continuity of Klal Yisrael. Meaning, big deal that the people that are now trying to prevent us from carrying on Ratzon Hashem are Jews. So they were Nazis, and they were inquisitors, and they were Bolsheviks, and they were Cossacks. Now they're kibbutznikim, and now they're the Knesset. I don't care who it is that is holding me back from my Avodas Hashem, but I'm willing to die for it. You understand? Meaning, I'm willing to be myself, because that is the only thing that ensures the survival of Klal Yisrael. You understand that when they threaten you, take away the money, you take away the security, blah, 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 blah. So, okay, so do whatever you want to do. We will do whatever we can to make it as nice for us as possible. But if push comes to shove, and you're going to say, we're going to throw you in jail if you don't join the army, I'll say, okay. And what did our grandparents do? What did their grandparents do? When somebody said, leave the yeshiva, or we'll throw you in jail, they went to jail. That's what they did. That's what happened. You understand what you're talking about is a group of Jews with a mentality and a perspective that is 2,000 years old, well-tested and perfected. This is not something that is coming out of nowhere. So what about us, religious Zionism? Where does that come in? Now, everybody's buying a Shramel and moving to Kiryas Ya'ar. Maybe. So it's a medrash. It's a medrash in this week's parsha. That's why Badafka wanted to talk about it this week. It's a medrash. It's a medrash that the pasuk says it, and you will find this slight variations in the Medrash Tanchuma, and in the Medrash Rabbah, and in the Yalkut Shmona. Meaning this is a well-discussed medrash. This medrash, we'll quote it from, it's probably fullest in the Tanchuma. Tanchuma says like this. Tanchuma Shmos Kuf Chav Gimel, or you'll find this almost the same thing in Medrash Rabbah. Medrash Rabbah, Shmos Rabbah in Parsha Hey is Tes, the end. Pasuk quotes Pasuk in the Medrash quotes Pasuk in Eov. Pasuk says, "Your im el bekoloi niflaos." And HaKadosh Baruch Hu will make enormous sounds. Your aim, he's going to make a ram. He's going to make thunderous sounds. Bekoloi niflaos, and with his voice, it's going to be wondrous things. What is these wondrous things? When did HaKadosh Baruch Hu make wondrous things with his voice? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to send Moshe Rabbeinu to redeem the Jewish people, he was in Midian. Misyare, he was afraid. You'd run away to Midian because maybe Paro wants to kill him. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to him in Midian, and he says to him, he goes to Mitzrayim, go back to Mitzrayim. This is Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush, this week's parsha. Shenema, as the pasuk says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe b'Midian. Hashem says to Moshe in Midian, Leich shuv Mitzrayim, go, return back to Egypt. That statement of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe b'Midian, Leich shuv Mitzrayim, go back to Egypt. Go back to Egypt. What happens to that? Nechlak hadibur l'shnei kolos. That voice splits in two. That's the niflos of the voice of Hashem. It splits in two. V'naseh du partzufim. And now it becomes two faces. Now, those that are familiar with a little bit of Kabbalah know that phraseology of du partzufim, that Adam and Chava were made du partzufim. This is Gemara. As well, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Adam and Chava du partzufim. Kabbalah, they speak about this a lot. Adam and Chava were originally made with two faces back to back. Du partzufim, two, meaning that this voice is now in two directions. One statement of Hashem. What's the statement of Hashem? go redeem the Jewish people. Geula is going to begin now. The Geula is going to begin. And it splits into two voices. V'shama Moshe b'Midyan, Moshe Rabbeinu hears in Midyan, Lech shuv Mitzrayim, go back to Egypt. What's the other voice? Va'aron shama b'Mitzrayim, Aaron heard the same voice in Egypt, and it said to him, Lech likras Moshe midbara, leave Egypt and go and meet Moshe in the desert. Meaning, the voice of Geula of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the voice of redemption, that nevuah of redemption, is heard in two ways. That voice of redemption is either redemption is beginning, leave now, go back, off you go. That's it. Geula has started, we finish now. Get out, leave. And there's another voice that says, Geula is starting, but there's a long way to go. It's still going to be weeks and months and maybe a year or more in Mitzrayim of suffering. The Geula still exists with the Jewish people in Galus. And these two versions of reality is whether or not we accept that Galus and Geula can exist simultaneously. For Moshe Rabbeinu, Galus and Geula are a process that while we're in Egypt, we are beginning the process of Geula. And for Aaron, it's one of two things. Either we're in Egypt or we're free. That's the medrash. One of two things is happening. Either we are in a process of Geula, and the voice of Hashem is calling to us, saying that even in Egypt, Geula is beginning. There will be 10 plagues, and in each one there will be a shtickle Geula, and there'll be Geula and Geula and Geula and Geula. Or you're in Galus until Hashem says leave, and then you leave, and then Geula has occurred. Is Geula a multi-step process, or is it instantaneous? And the perspective of the vast majority of Jews throughout the vast majority of history was the perspective of Aaron, which is it'll happen in an instant. We will be in Galus until Hashem says, leave. Go. The voice of Geula means, if it's Geula, it means now and it means complete. That's it. And we will wait in Galus until that voice comes and tells us it's time to go. This is the perspective that Rashi quotes from the Medrash Rabbah, that the Beis HaMikdash will descend in fire. We will not build the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash will descend in fire. You have this in many Gemaras and many Midrashim. This is Rashi Masech Sukkah, that the Beis HaMikdash is going to descend in fire. And then you have the perspective of the Rambam, which is not. You will build the Beis HaMikdash with your hands. Who's correct? It's Machlokes Moshe and Aaron. And both of them, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both of them are correct. For Moshe Rabbeinu it means, go and express Geula to the Jewish people step by step. And for Aaron it means, Geula has already happened. Meaning, if it's happened, it's happened, completely. There's no such thing as partial Geula. By the way, this Machlokes between Moshe and Aaron is the Machlokes that existed in the days of the Alter Rebbe, between the Alter Rebbe and the middle of Rimanov, whether or not we want the Tsar to win or we want Napoleon to win. And the Alter Rebbe was strongly of the opinion that, what do you say, Planya Noif, Planya Rodif, that the Tsar is adulterer and he's a murderer, but he still believes in a God. As opposed to Napoleon, who doesn't believe in anything, and he doesn't want the Jews to believe in anything. And if you open up, if you emancipate the Jews of Europe, it's true that they will suffer less, but we will hemorrhage Jews. keep the walls up. Which is why fundamentally Chabad is anti-Zionist. It's why the Rebbe never held at the State of Israel. Because on a fundamental level, the Shita of Chabad is we love every single Jew. You can fight or not. I mean, it's a complex philosophy. But there is no religious validity to the State of Israel whatsoever. It's not the Geula at all. At all. There's no Geula there. When Mashiach comes, there will be no Knesset. There will be no Supreme Court. It's not that the Knesset and the Supreme Court will become Shomer Torah, Mitzvah, Klal Lo. The whole thing will be demolished. Hopefully it should be peaceful and it should be wonderful. But as far as the Rebbe was concerned, the whole thing is antithetical to what Geula is. And we will not accept anything less than Geula Shlema. We don't want partial Geula. We want Geula Shlema. Anything less than that is narishkat. It's worthless. Because the goal is to survive until Geula Shlema. Don't start having bits and pieces of Geula. It's the perspective of Aaron HaKohen. The perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu is not. Even in Mitzrayim, you can have a shtickle Geula.
But neither one is saying the Geula, go to Eretz Yisrael to start the Geula. He's starting it in Egypt.
Yeah, it means, but does it mean that Golus is over? What does it mean? No, Golus will take a while to be over. For Aaron, it means, Geula, let's go. If it's Geula, let's go now. Moshe Rabbeinu says, no. It's a process. It's a process. And the Shita of Aaron HaKohen, this is Medrash. The Shita of Aaron HaKohen is that there's no process. It's an instant. This machlokes, by the way, I can show you 1,000 places in Shas. But this machlokes lekan and lekan is l'orach kol derech in Shas. You see throughout Shas that there are two sides to this. This is Rabbi Yochanan versus Shmuel. But how to understand the Nevi'im when they prophesied about Yemos Mashiach? Is that all the Nevi'im talking about Yemos Mashiach, or are they talking about Olam Haba? Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel.
Can you go back to this as the original source?
This is the first time that this is listed. That this machlokes is this. And what I'm trying to say here is, on a fundamental level, L'tovus Shitas, our brothers and sisters of anti-Zionist from Jews, they have a Shita. And the question is, so why are they wrong? And I'll say this al regel achas, and maybe we'll pick this up next week. Why are they wrong? Because the Metzius is not like they described. The Metzius is that Klal Yisrael has returned back to Eretz Yisrael. It has happened. And that Klal Yisrael is getting closer and closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael. The state of Israel is becoming more and more and more religious, year by year. What we are finding is that, yes, it did happen in a different order. A different order from the Siddur. A different order from how we imagine. And there are riots throughout Shas, and we can talk about them next week. But that's also a possibility. I mean, the reason that they're wrong is because they're wrong. Meaning, it didn't happen that way. It happened another way. It is happening, and it happened differently from how they said. And that doesn't mean that there isn't validity to their approach. But in the same way that once upon a time, if you thought that the Rambam was a kofar, that was a valid religious perspective. If you lived in the 1300s, 1200s in France, and you thought that the Rambam was a kofar, that was legitimate. Hey, maybe you weren't a nice guy depending on how you dealt with it, but it was a legitimate halachic opinion. If you lived in the 1700s and you thought that the Baal Shem Tov was a rebirth of Sabbatean Messianism, that was a legitimate opinion. Today, if you hold that the Baal Shem Tov was trying to be a false Mashiach, now you're a kofar. And if you hold that the Rambam was an apikaris, you're a kofar. Because Klal Yisrael has decided. Klal Yisrael has decided that the Rambam is valid, that the Baal Shem Tov is valid. Klal Yisrael has decided that. And Klal Yisrael has decided that Medinas Yisrael is the Jewish homeland. Klal Yisrael has decided that. Rov Minyan and Binyan of Klal Yisrael has decided that, which means that those that don't are now the Das Yachid. They were the majority, and now they're the minority. That's just what's happened. The same way that once upon a time, Beis Shammai was the much larger school, and they were outvoted 2-3 generations later by Beis Hillel. And now if you hold like Beis Shammai, now you're antithetical to the Rov Minyan and Binyan of Klal Yisrael. That's just the way that it is. The majority of Klal Yisrael holds of the state of Israel.
When you say the hold of the state of Israel, what do you mean?
Meaning, how do you understand the state of Israel if it is not the beginning of Geula? If it is not part of the process of Geula, it must be that it is, and this was the language of the Satmar Rebbe, that it's a Ma'aseh Satan, it's a distraction from the Geula. It's one or the other. There are only two ways of looking at it, if you're intellectually honest. Either this is the Geula, or this is the same as the Cossacks and Khmelnytsky, and those are the two ways of looking at it. And whereas maybe in 1910, maybe even in 1930, maybe even in 1940, maybe even by 1950, there was what to talk about. But Tafshin Pei Vav, where we're holding now, it's very clear that it is not. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues in Israel. I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory and everything's beautiful and everybody loves Yiddishkeit and that the Bagatz is supportive of Jewish religious right to self-determinism. It's not.
But the governing authority does believe in Shomer Torah mitzvahs.
100%. And even the people that are not within that are within the government that don't, they recognize the validity of it. There's shilas about money and about army service, but overwhelmingly, this thing called Klal Yisrael returning to Eretz Yisrael has worked, and I'll give you the raya to it. And I made a Haredi friend very upset about this when I spoke to him about this a little while ago. I asked him the following question: do you believe? I said, where did the Gadol Hadar live today? He said, in Israel. I said, do you believe that there will be another Gadol Hadar that will be born and raised and educated in America? And he got very upset with me for asking that question. He said, no. I said, why not? He said, no. Because the yeshiva world, the Torah world is in Israel. Right? The Torah world is now in Eretz Yisrael. For the first time since Churban Bayis Rishon.
It's not in Lakewood.
It's not in Lakewood. 30 years ago, when you had Reb Aaron, and you had Soloveitchik, and you had Moshe Feinstein, it was like 40 years ago, and you had the Lubavitch Rebbe, and you had the Satmar Rebbe. It was very clear that the Rov Minyan and Binyan of Torah Yisrael was in America. In the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Certainly since, the last 20 years, Torah has moved. The Gedolim are all in Eretz Yisrael. Whoever you want to hold is a Gadol. Pick your Gadol. They don't live in America. They don't live in America. That's just it. That's the reality. The Gedolim don't live in Chutz La'aretz. All the Gedolim live in Eretz Yisrael. That's where it is. Meaning Torah now is in Eretz Yisrael. And I'm not saying that they are wonderful Talmidei Chachamim and great mostes and tremendous chesed and beautiful. It's all true. But Torah has moved to Eretz Yisrael. That's the truth. Which means that if you're voting against the state of Israel, bichlal, if you're voting against that institution of the state of Israel, saying that it is an antithetical institution to the future of Klal Yisrael, that it is a threat to the future of Klal Yisrael. Maybe you had a valid opinion 50 years ago, but you don't have a valid opinion anymore. It's not true anymore. I mean, the Satmar Rebbe's opinion when he wrote Vayel Moshe, I think was a very valid opinion. I think it was status quo of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. It's not anymore. Which is al regel achas, what I think is happening and why I think they're wrong. And why I think there's kedusha and tara and beauty to that mahalach. But I think it's Beis Shammai. And I think Klal Yisrael is passing against Beis Shammai. And while it's true that Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, halachic ve'sela. And it's important for us to understand that they're coming from a perspective of Kedusha and Ta'ah. I don't think that they're coming from any ill will. And I think that there's beauty and tremendous Torah in everything that they say. And they're also dead wrong. That's just the reality. So Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. But ultimately, it's Moshe Rabbeinu that takes us out of Mitzrayim. It's not Aaron. And that's the reality. Now, there's a billion more things to say about this, but that's enough for tonight.